welcome to lesson 3A-4. In 3A-3 we looked at factoring when A was going to be equal to 1. Today we're going to take things and step it up a notch, and we're going to look at factoring trinomials where A is not equal to 1. So our learning target is still that I can factor quadratic trinomials of the form ax squared plus bx plus c. The difference is now, instead of a always being 1 and just having x squared as our leading term, we're going to start throwing some other numbers in there and seeing how that affects our factoring. So, if the leading coefficient is a number larger than 1, we're going to have to consider how this will affect our first term in each parentheses. If you think about where our numbers come from when we multiply binomials, remember our standard form is ax squared plus bx plus c. Alright, we get the a when we're multiplying binomials from when we multiply the first term by the first term of the second binomial. We multiply those two numbers there, and we get the first term. To get the c, that comes from when we're distributing, and we take this term times this term. Our last two terms multiplied together is going to give us our c. Now, our outer and inner products, when we multiply the outside numbers and the inside numbers together, that is going to give us our b. Now, in our previous lessons, these numbers here were always 1s when we factored. And when we multiplied 1 times a number and 1 times a number, we ended up with whatever the other number was. But now that we are looking at factoring where a is not equal to 1, we're going to have to break these numbers down into something different, so it's going to affect the numbers differently depending on where we put them. For example, if we put a 3 here and a 2 here, that's going to affect these numbers differently. For example, if I put a 4 here and let's say a 2 here, and I multiplied this out, that would be 3 times 2 would give me a 6, and 4 times 2 would give me an 8. This product, this sum of 14 would be a lot different than if I switched the 4 and the 2. If I were to switch the 4 and the 2, and if I put the 2 here and the 4 here, what I now have is 3 times 4, which is 12, and 2 times 2, which is 4, and that's going to give me a sum of 16. So we can see now that we are putting different numbers here other than 1, that the order where we put these is going to have an effect on what our product is going to be. So let's go ahead and look at some examples. So we're still going to want to use a chart to help us keep us on track and focused with our guess and check methods. But we're going to want to add an extra column. We're going to want to list our factors of A and our factors of C. So if I am listing my factors, I'm going to first look at my 5. I'm going to think, what can I multiply together to give me 5? Now the first one that comes to mind is 5 times 1. And in fact, on 5 times 1 is our only factor since 5 is prime. Now I want to look at what can multiply to give me 2. Now I want to use a little bit of critical thinking here. I can see that my c is going to have to be positive. That means my two factors are either going to both have to be positive or they're going to have to both be negative so that I can multiply together to give me a positive 2. Because we only get positive when we multiply the same signs together. Now if I look at my other sign here, it's going to be positive. Now I can't get a positive if I multiply a negative times a negative. I can only get a positive when I multiply a positive times a positive. So I know my factors of C are going to have to be positive. Now if I'm thinking about my factors of 2, I'm going to have 1 and 2. Now if you remember though, we are going to have to worry about the order of those terms. So I'm going to try it also as 2 times 1. Alright, and we can see how this is going to give us a different product. So for my first one, I would have a 5 times 1 plus 1 times 2. all I'm doing is multiplying the first factor times the first factor and the second factor times the second factor. So 5 times 1 would be 5, and 1 times 2 would be 2, and 5 plus 2 is 7. Now that does not give us the 11 that is in our middle term. However, if we go ahead with our next set, and we do 5 times 2, and 1 times 1, 5 times 2 is 10, and 1 times 1 is 1, and 10 plus 1 is going to be 11, which is going to give us our middle term here. So now I have what factors I'm going to use. I'm going to go ahead and set up my parentheses. Now I know that I have a 5x and a 1x, or just an x, in my first set of parentheses because they were my first factors. Now I want to make sure that I match my multiplication up with how I had it up here. So we multiplied 5 times 2, so that 2 is going to have to be the term here. That way I'm doing my 5 times 2 when I do the outside. And my 1 is going to have to go here. So I can do 1 times x. Now these are always problems that you can check yourself on. If we go ahead and do the multiplication out, if we multiplied 5 times x, that's going to give us 5x squared. Then 5x times 2 is going to give us 10x. 1 times x is going to give us just x. And 1 times 2 is going to give us 2. I combine my like terms, 5x squared, a 10x and a 1x is going to give me 11x, and I have plus 2, which is exactly what I started with. So I can now see that I definitely have factored this correctly. Alright, let's look at another example. So in this case, we're given 4x squared minus 9x plus 5. So we're going to start out listing some factors of the first terms again. I can list 4 times 1. Alright, and I can list 2 times 2. So I'm going to use some combination of those. Now I want to again look at my signs to see if they can give me any hints. So if I'm looking at my sign in front of my C, I can see that my product is going to have to give me a positive output. Again, just like the last problem, the only way we can do that is by multiplying a positive times a positive, or a negative times a negative. If we look at the sign on our B, though, we see that this is negative. So unlike the last one where we had to add and get a positive number, in this case we're going to have to get a negative number, which means both our signs are going to have to be negative. So if I'm looking at my factors of 5, I only have 5 and 1. So I'm going to list a negative 5 and a negative 1 so that we can work our signs out. And I'm going to do that for both of these. Now also I want to remember that I need to think about the order of these. So even though I've written down these factors already of 4 and 1 and 2 and 2, I want to do it again one more time. And this time I'm going to write negative 1, negative 5, and negative 1, negative 5. Switch that order up for us. So if I'm looking at this, I'm going to have 4 times negative 5 plus 1 times negative 1. And that is going to give me a negative 20 and a negative 1, which is going to be negative 21, which is not what we're looking for. Remember, we want to get negative 9. Alright, if I do the next one, I would have 2 times negative 5, and I would have 2 times negative 1. Alright, so 2 times negative 5 would be negative 10, and 2 times negative 1 would be negative 2. So that would give me a negative 12, which is still not what I'm looking for. Now, just to prove a point, I want to jump down to this one real quick. Notice in this one, our factors are the same. So even when we switch the order on this one, we're still going to have the 2 times negative 1 and the 2 times negative 5. That is not going to change since our two factors of our A term were both the same. However, with this one, since it's 4 and 1, our order is going to change. So if I do 4 times negative 1 plus 1 times negative 5, 4 times negative 1 is negative 4, 1 times negative 5 is negative 5, that's going to give me a negative 9, which is exactly what I'm looking for. So I know that this is going to be my set of factors that I want to use. So I'm going to again fill in my parentheses with my first factors, 4x and x. And I multiplied the 4 times the negative 1, so I want to make sure the negative 1 goes in the opposite set of parentheses from the 4. And I multiplied the 1 times the negative 5, so I want to make sure the negative 5 goes in the opposite set of parentheses. And I have my completely factored factoring. Alright, so let's keep going at some of these examples. Now, one thing I see in example 3 right away is that I'm going to have a greatest common factor. Remember, we talked in 3A-2 that it is always the strategy that we want to check first. So if we can have a common factor, we want to go ahead and pull that out. So in this case, we can see that 2 is going to go into both 2, 4, 6, 2, 4, and negative 6. So before I even start factoring, I'm going to factor out that 2. I'm going to have x squared plus 2x minus 3. And you'll notice that this is actually going to break down to be an a equals 1 problem, just like the last one. So we don't have to worry about the inner products quite as much, because we know when we break this down, we're going to have x and x, and it's not going to change what we're going to have when we multiply. Alright, so we had negative 3 as our C term, so we know that we have to have one positive and one negative. So I know that I'm going to have one positive number and one negative number when I factor. Now if I look at my B sign, I can see that it's positive, so I need my positive number to be bigger. So with 3, I only have two factors, 3 and 1, and using that process we just used with the signs, I know that since this is positive, I need my bigger number to be positive and my smaller number to be negative, and I'm going to have my factor. Alright, so we want to make sure we don't forget that 2 that we pulled out, but then we're just going to factor the term on the inside here. Alright, let's move on to example 4. Alright, so looking at this example, we are not lucky enough to have a greatest common factor this time. We don't have anything that will go into 6, negative 11, and negative 10. So we're going to want to go ahead and start with our guess and check method. Now I'm thinking of my factors of 6. I'm just going to jot them down up here. I know I'm going to have 6 and 1, and I know I'm going to have 2 and 3. So I'm going to use some combination of those. So I'm just going to start out with 6 and 1, and we'll work our way down if we have to. Hopefully sometimes we can get good at our guessing, and we might be able to start with just guessing 1 or 2 pairs and being alright from there and not having to list out all the factors. But sometimes we might need to go ahead and list them all out. We'll see how this one goes. I'm also going to look at negative 10, which can break down into 5 times 2 and also 1 times 10. Now I want to see if I can get any clues about my signs again. Now I notice that my C is a negative, so that means I'm going to need to have a positive and a negative. So one of these will be positive and one of these will be negative. Now it is going to be a little trickier this time because we're going to do some multiplying. We won't necessarily always be able to assume that because this is negative that the bigger number will be negative, because we have to think about our multiplication. So we do have to try a little bit more trial and error on this. So let's just go ahead and see what we can figure out. We'll do some guessing and checking and hope that we don't have to go through everything. But let's start out with 6 and 1. So if I have 6 and 1 as my factors for 6, and I want to look at these, let's say, go ahead, I'm going to do negative 5 and positive 2 and see what we can get. Alright, so 6 times negative 5 and 1 times 2 is going to give me a negative 30 plus 2, which is going to give me a 28. Alright, so I seem pretty far off on that guess with the 6 and the 1, so I'm going to try and mix it up, and I can come back to that 6 and 1 and try some different combinations later, but let's go ahead and try a 3 and a 2. So I'm going to try the first factors of 3 and 2 this time, and let's go ahead and stick with that negative 5 and negative 2. Or a negative 5 and a positive 2, sorry. So if I do 3 times negative 5, and I have a 2 times 2. 3 times negative 5 is going to give me negative 15, and a positive 4, which is going to give me the negative 11 that I was looking for. So if I wouldn't have found it on my second guess, I would have wanted to keep going. And you might have tried the 6 and the 1 with different combinations before you move to the 3 and the 2. It's going to take some practice, some kind of getting used to seeing how some of these numbers behave. But the more you practice, the quicker you're going to recognize what are your reasonable guesses and what guesses are going to get you something far off, like a positive 20 or a negative 28 when you're looking for something a little bit smaller. So I'm going to go ahead and put my parentheses down. I have a 3x and I have a 2x. I multiply the 3 times negative 5, so the negative 5 has to go in the opposite set of parentheses. And my positive 2 is going to go in my first set of parentheses. And I have this factored out. Alright, there is one additional consideration when factoring trinomials in which a is negative. We talked in 3A-2 how we don't like having a leading coefficient that is negative. We want to go ahead and factor out that negative 1 from each term before we use any other factoring methods. So because I have a negative on the 6x, the first thing I'm going to want to do is factor out that negative. Now remember, that's going to change the signs on everything else. So it's going to become a positive 6x squared. Our plus 13x is going to become minus 13x. And our negative 2 is going to become a positive 2. So we are going to have to now factor what we have on the inside here. I'm going to start out with a 6 and a 1. I can break down that 6 into a 6 and 1 and a 3 and 2. Alright, now with 2 I can only break that down into 2 and 1. So that's going to help us limit our choices a little bit from what we have to choose from. As always, I want to check to see what my signs are to see if they can give me any hint. I see that it is a positive, which means I'm either going to have a positive times a positive or a negative times a negative. And if I look at the sign on B, I see that it's negative, so we know we're going to have a negative times a negative. Alright, so I have 6 and 1. I'm going to go ahead and try negative 2 and negative 1 and see what happens. And so when I multiply out, I'm going to do 6 times negative 2 and 1 times negative 1. And when I add those together, 6 times negative 2 is going to give me a negative 12. 1 times negative 1 is going to give me a negative 1. A negative 12 and a negative 1 is going to give me a negative 13. Remember, we're looking at this factored out version, not this one. So actually that does match. We happen to get lucky and get it on our first guess. Just to reiterate the fact one more time of how the order matters, I'm just going to break it down 6, 1 again and switch this order around. This time I would have 6 times negative 1 plus 1 times negative 2. 6 times negative 1 is negative 6. 1 times negative 2 is negative 2. That would give me negative 8. So you can see again that this order between these factors is going to matter. Now, remember, at the very beginning we factored out a negative. So I'm going to make sure I put that negative at the very beginning before I do anything else. Now, the factors that we used was this set here. So when we broke it down, we had a 6x and a 1x. We multiplied the 6 times negative 2, so negative 2 goes in the opposite set of parentheses. And we had negative 1 times the positive 1, so we put those in opposite sets of parentheses. And we have our factored form. So just a reminder, when you factor out negative 1 in an early step, we have to carry that through all the way to the rest of the steps. We can't factor out the negative 1 here and then forget to put it in down here. Alright, again, there's no application for lesson 3A-4. Make sure that you complete your practice, get a good understanding of factoring when a is not equal to 1, and go ahead and begin to study for your mastery check. See you guys in the next video.